There was a dent in the plaster of the sitting-room wall, low and to the left of the mantel, about the height a man's hand might rest if he were sitting in the second chair and not thinking about his hand at all. It was not large. A thumb could cover it more or less if a thumb ever went looking. Around the small crater the paper had cracked in 3 thin lines, like the spokes of a wheel drawn by a child who had grown bored before the wheel was done, and into those cracks, over some unmeasured number of months, a fine grey dust had settled and stayed. Nobody had put it there. Nobody had taken it away. It had simply become part of the wall, the way a scar becomes part of a hand, and on the first warm morning of April it sat there in the early light doing nothing at all, holding its small history to itself, waiting without knowing it was waiting. If you had stood in the doorway of that room and listened before anyone spoke, you would have heard the house at rest. A clock on the mantel ticking, the soft claps of a coal that had burned through in the grate and given up its shape. Far below, muffled by 2 floors and a closed street door, the ordinary churn of Baker Street getting on with its morning, a cart, a voice, a horse shifting its weight from one foot to another and back. None of it hurried. None of it meant anything yet. The room breathed slowly, warm along one wall where the sun had reached it. Cool in the corners the sun had not, and the dent in the plaster kept its silence among a great deal of other silence. One small unremarkable thing in a room that had grown comfortable being unremarked upon. It was into this settled hush that Mrs. Hudson arrived, and the settled hush did not survive her. She came up the 17 stairs at a pace that was not quite quick and not quite slow. The pace of a woman who has decided something and sees no reason to hurry toward what is already inevitable. On the landing she paused. Through the door she could hear the particular quality of 2 men not doing very much. The rustle of a newspaper handled without real interest. The scrape of a match. A sigh that belonged to Dr. Watson, who sighed the way other men cleared their throats, as punctuation rather than complaint. She stood a moment with her hand on the door and looked, without any tenderness she would have admitted to, at the brass of the handle, which wanted polishing, and at the line of grey along the skirting, which wanted a cloth, and at the whole accumulated evidence of a winter spent indoors that only she seemed able to see. Then she opened the door, and the morning changed its mind about being peaceful. "Good morning," said Mrs. Hudson, in the tone of a general announcing terms. Sherlock Holmes was in his chair by the cold end of the hearth, a dressing gown over his shoulders and a sheaf of newsprint across his knees, and he did not look up. Dr. Watson, at the table by the window, did look up, because Dr. Watson had learned over some years of tenancy that Mrs. Hudson's good mornings came in more than one variety, and that this particular one, flat, level, faintly ceremonial, was not the sort that meant good morning. It meant that a decision had been reached in the lower regions of the house, that it had been reached some time ago, and that they were only now being informed of it as a courtesy they had not earned. "Mrs. Hudson," said Watson cautiously. "It is," said Mrs. Hudson, "the 14th of April. It is the first warm day we have had, and by the smell of the street it will not be the last. And I have looked at this room, gentlemen, through the whole of a long winter, and I have said nothing." She let that settle. She was a woman who understood the uses of a pause almost as well as the man in the chair, though she would never have said so, and he would never have granted it. "I have said nothing," she went on, "about the state of the carpet. I have said nothing about the correspondence. I have said nothing about what is living under the settee, which I do not care to name before luncheon. And this morning I have decided to stop saying nothing." Holmes turned a page. "You have chosen an admirable day for it," he said to the newspaper. "The light is excellent. You will be able to see everything you object to with real clarity." "I can see it now, Mr. Holmes." "Then I congratulate you on your eyesight and would ask only that you exercise it elsewhere." Mrs. Hudson crossed the room, and here the first small motion of the day began, the first of the hundreds of small motions that would fill it. And she took hold of the nearer window sash with both hands and drew it up. It came grudgingly. The wood swollen along its edges after months of never being asked to move, and it rose the last few inches with a long complaining groan that ran up through the frame and out into the room like a note held too long on a badly tuned instrument. And with the window open, the outside came in. It came in all at once, the way water comes into a boat through a seam you had not known was there. The clatter of a passing dray, iron rims on stone, a costermonger somewhere below, calling watercress in the 2-note sing-song that meant spring more surely than any calendar. The particular thin racket of sparrows arguing in the plane trees down the street, and under all of it the low, continuous murmur of a city at work, which you never heard until a window opened and reminded you it had been there the whole time, patiently making its noise outside the glass. The room, which had been sealed all winter into its own small climate of coal smoke and pipe smoke, and the smell of paper and dogs and men, took a breath of April and did not quite know what to do with it. Holmes lowered his newspaper by perhaps 2 inches. "You have let the street in," he observed. "I have let the air in. They arrived together. I hold you responsible for both." Watson, watching this the way a man watches 2 cats decide whether they are going to fight, found that he was smiling and turned it toward the window so that neither party would see. He had lived through a Mrs. Hudson's spring cleaning exactly once before in his first year at Baker Street, and he retained of it only a general impression of upheaval and the specific memory of a chair he had been fond of vanishing for a full week and returning smelling of vinegar. He had not enjoyed it. He suspected he was not about to enjoy this. And yet there was something in the raised window and the noise of the street and the great slab of morning light now lying across the carpet that made the coming disruption feel less like a punishment and more like a season changing, which, he reflected, it was. "Doctor," said Mrs. Hudson without turning around, "I shall want your help, and I shall want it to be actual help, which I distinguish from the kind of help Mr. Holmes gives, which consists of explaining what one is doing wrong while one does it." "I am at your disposal," said Watson, and meant it more or less. "You are at my disposal with this." And she produced from somewhere about her person with the ease of a conjurer, a duster, a square of soft yellow cloth, worn thin at one corner, that had clearly seen long service and would see more. She held it out to him across the table. Watson took it. He looked at it. It was, he understood, a commission of a kind, and it came with precisely as much authority as a duster comes with, which is to say none. He was being enlisted, not promoted. He folded the cloth over his hand and felt faintly, pleasantly ridiculous, a doctor of medicine and a veteran of a hard campaign, standing in a sunlit room holding a yellow rag and awaiting instructions. "And what," said Holmes from the chair, in the voice of a man determined to remain uninvolved by cataloguing his non-involvement in detail, "is my part to be in this festival of improvement?" Mrs. Hudson turned and looked at him. It was a long look, and it took its time, and it travelled over him the way his own looks travelled over a stranger's coat and boots, reading, weighing, arriving at conclusions. She saw a man who would be underfoot within the hour. She saw a man who would rescue objects from the bin the moment her back was turned, who would deliver a small lecture on the meaning of each one, who would argue that the disorder she proposed to destroy was in fact an intricate and irreplaceable system that only appeared to be a mess to the untrained eye. She had heard the system speech before. She did not propose to hear it today if it could be prevented. "Your part, Mr. Holmes," she said, "is the window seat. You will sit in it. You will sit in it with the whole of the sun on you, which will be pleasant, and you will not touch anything, which will be difficult, and above all you will not interfere. If you can manage those 3 things, you may consider yourself of enormous assistance. You are asking me to do nothing. I am asking you to do nothing, and I am aware," said Mrs. Hudson, "of the size of what I am asking." There was a silence then that had some real feeling in it, the affectionate stand-off of people who have shared a roof long enough to have worn grooves into one another, and into that silence the mantel clock dropped its steady tick, 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 unbothered, keeping its own time as it had kept it through every argument this room had ever hosted. And Holmes, who could out-argue a magistrate and had done, discovered that there was no argument to be had with a woman who was entirely right and entirely calm and holding a broom. He set aside his newspaper. He rose, with the loose economy that made even his ordinary movements look faintly like a decision, and he crossed to the window seat, and he sat down in it, in the hole of the sun, exactly as instructed, with the air of a monarch accepting exile on generous terms. "I shall supervise," he announced. "You shall do no such thing. I shall supervise silently, and you will not know I am doing it, and it will improve the work immeasurably." Mrs. Hudson chose not to hear this, which was a skill she had, and she began. She began, as she began everything, at the edges and worked in. And here the room's long, slow transformation started, so gradually that if you had blinked, you would have missed its beginning. She lifted the small things first, a vase that held no flowers and had held none for a season, 3 pens and a paper knife from the writing table, a stack of yellow-backed novels that Watson recognised as his own and reddened faintly to see counted. Each object she picked up she considered for the length of a single breath, deciding its fate, kept, moved, cleaned or condemned, and then she set it in one of the small territories she was establishing on the cleared end of the table, a colony of the saved, a smaller colony of the doomed. The doomed colony, Watson noted, was growing faster, and through all of it, the clock ticked, and the street came in through the open window, and Mrs. Hudson began, very softly, almost below hearing, to hum. It was not a tune Watson knew. It had the shapeless, comfortable roundness of a tune a person hums to themselves without noticing they are doing it, a tune worn smooth by years of use, and it wove itself in among the tick of the clock and the murmur of Baker Street, until the three sounds together made a kind of fabric, a steady woven texture of small noise that filled the room and asked nothing of anyone. Watson found, standing there with his duster, that he had begun to breathe in time with it. He suspected Holmes had too, and would rather have died than admit it. "You may begin," said Mrs. Hudson to Watson, "with the mantel." Watson looked at the mantel. It was, he thought, the single most crowded surface in a room composed almost entirely of crowded surfaces, a shelf of curiosities and abandonments layered so deep that the marble underneath had not been seen in living memory. There were letters skewered to the very centre of it by a jackknife driven into the wood, a great fan of unanswered correspondence that Holmes maintained was a filing system, and everyone else maintained was a fire hazard. There was a tobacco jar. There was the famous Persian slipper, its toe stuffed with shag, curled and comfortable as an old cat. There were coins, and a bullet or two, and a single dried orange stuck all over with cloves that had lost its scent so long ago that no one could say who had made it, or why. Watson approached this archaeology with his yellow cloth, and the private conviction that he was disturbing something that ought perhaps to have been left to science. "Not the letters," said Holmes from the window-seat sharply. "The letters," said Mrs. Hudson without looking round, "most particularly. There is a system to the letters, Watson. Their position is meaningful. The ones nearest the knife are the ones I intend to answer. The ones at the outer edges are from November," said Mrs. Hudson, "and one of them from the year before. And if you intended to answer them, Mr. Holmes, you have had a great deal of time in which to begin." And she said it without heat, in the same level pleasant tone she used for everything, and it landed harder for that. The way a plain, true thing, spoken kindly, will always land harder than an insult. Holmes subsided into the window-seat in the sunlight, and he did not concede the point, because he never conceded. A point, but he stopped defending it, which from him amounted to the same thing. For a while, then, there was only the work. Watson lifted the first letter free. The knife held it firm, and he had to work the blade a little to loosen it, and beneath it the marble showed a clean pale rectangle, where a decade of coal dust had not reached, a small window into what the mantel had looked like before it became a monument to postponement. He set the letter on the table, in neither colony yet, awaiting judgment. He lifted the next. Below him, and behind him, the room went on assembling its steady sounds. The clock, the hum, the street, and now the soft repeated whisper of the cloth over marble, wiping years off in strokes. Mrs. Hudson had moved to the bookshelves and begun taking down volumes 2 and 3 at a time, knocking their spines together to loosen the dust, and each dull, soft clap of book against book fell into the rhythm of the morning and was absorbed by it, and the light moved. That was the thing Watson would remember afterward, more than any single object of the many they turned up that day, the way the light moved. When they had begun, the sun had lain in a long, clean bar across the near end of the carpet, and now, without anyone watching it happen, it had crept perhaps a hand's breadth toward the centre of the room, gilding a patch of worn turkey red that had not been gilded an hour before, finding in the pile a whole galaxy of floating dust that their work had raised, so that the air above the carpet swam and glittered like water disturbed. Holmes, in the window-seat, watched the dust turn in the light with the concentrated stillness of a man watching something genuinely interesting, and said nothing, and for once his saying nothing was not a tactic. "That," he said at last, quietly to no one, "is a remarkable quantity of the past." "It is a remarkable quantity of dust, Mr. Holmes," said Mrs. Hudson, "and it is going out of the window where it belongs." Downstairs, faint through the open sash, A kettle began to sing. It was the maid, of course, 2 floors down, setting the morning to rights in her own department while the war was fought in this one, and the thin rising whistle of it climbed the stairwell and slipped into the room and lay down among the other sounds, and for a moment everything in the sitting room seemed to pause and gather around that small domestic note, the promise of tea, the oldest promise the house knew how to make. Watson stopped with a letter half lifted. Mrs. Hudson stopped with a book in each hand. Even Holmes in the window seat turned his head a fraction toward the sound, and the kettle sang its one clear rising note up through the floors, and the clock ticked, and the street murmured, and April came in warm across the sill, and the whole overturned room held for the length of 3 breaths in a kind of suspended ordinary contentment. 3 people and a task and a good morning to do it in. Then the kettle was lifted from the heat and its note bent downward and died, and the moment let them go, and Mrs. Hudson set down her books and looked about her at everything still to be done. The rugs not yet lifted, the settee not yet moved, the whole afternoon of it waiting, and drew a long breath through her nose and took up her humming again where she had left it, and reached for the next shelf. Watson turned back to the mantel. He worked the knife loose from the last of the letters, and as he lifted the blade clear of the wood, his eye went, without his quite meaning it to, past the emptied place on the shelf and down the pale plaster of the wall beyond, and came to rest. For no reason he could have named, the way the eye sometimes settles on the one small wrong thing in a familiar room, on a little dent in the plaster, low and to the left, no bigger than a thumb, 3 thin cracks running from it like spokes, greyed at the edges with the dust of some forgotten afternoon. He looked at it. He did not yet remember what it was. He set the knife down and reached for his cloth, and the morning went on. The second window did not come up any more willingly than the first. Mrs. Hudson set both hands to it and raised it in 3 short pulls, each pull answered by the same long groan of swollen wood dragging in its channel, and on the 3rd pull it gave all at once and shot up the last hand's breadth with a bang that sent a sparrow off the sill in a small explosion of wings. And now the room had 2 open mouths instead of 1, and the street doubled itself and poured in through both, and the difference was not twice as much noise but something changed in kind. A crossing of draughts, a through current of robuspril that lifted the corner of a letter on the table and turned a page of Holmes's abandoned newspaper without any hand near it. The room, which for the whole of a winter had held one still breath of coal and paper and pipe, now had weather moving through it, and it did not know the manners of the thing, and it fidgeted. Watson felt the draught find the back of his neck and turn cool there. He did not mind it. He had spent enough of his life in places where the air did not move at all, in tents and in wards, and in the long-stalled heat of an afternoon in a country that did not have Aprils, that he had come to regard moving air as a small daily kindness the world did not have to offer and did. He stood at the mantel with his yellow cloth and let the 2 windows argue their draught across the room, and below, in the street, a heavy wagon went by, with a load that shifted and boomed against its boards, and the iron rims of its wheels came down the granite setts in a long rolling clatter that rose up through the open sashes and filled the room to the ceiling, and then, as the wagon passed on toward the Marylebone Road, thinned and receded, and let the smaller sounds come back, the sparrows, the watercress man 2 streets off now, the clock. The wheels went, and the wheels came, all morning, in the way of a main thoroughfare, and Watson found, without deciding to, that he had begun to use them as a kind of clock of his own, a great slow irregular pulse under the small precise one on the mantel, so that time in the room came to be kept in 2 measures at once, the near and the far, the tick and the roll. "You have stopped," observed Mrs. Hudson from the bookshelves without turning round. Watson had stopped. He had a letter in one hand and the cloth in the other, and he had been listening to a wagon, which was not what he had been enlisted for. "I was considering," he said, "the best order of operations." "The best order of operations," said Mrs. Hudson, "is the one in which the work gets done. Begin with the jar. It has wanted emptying since Christmas." The jar was the tobacco jar, and it stood on the mantel where it had always stood, a squat thing of blue and white china with a chip out of its lid that had been there so long it had stopped being damaged and become character. Watson lifted it. It was lighter than he expected, which told its own small story about the state of Holmes's supply, and when he took the lid off, a smell came up out of it that was the concentrated soul of the whole room. Dark, sweet, faintly scorched, the accumulated ghost of 1,000 pipes, and hung about his face for a moment before the draught from the windows took it and pulled it apart and carried it off toward the street. He looked into the jar. There was a shallow drift of shag in the bottom, gone dry and dusty with age, and among it, because it was Holmes's jar, and nothing in that room was ever only one thing, a collar stud, a used railway ticket folded to a hard small square, and a single lucifer match that had been struck and had failed and been dropped back in for reasons known to no one now living. "There is a railway ticket in the tobacco," Watson reported. "There is a great deal in the tobacco," said Holmes from the window seat, "that repays study. I would ask you to lay those items aside and not on any account to throw them out. The ticket in particular is going in the fire," said Mrs. Hudson. "The ticket in particular," Holmes continued with the serene persistence of a man who has decided the interruption did not occur, "records a journey I took in the autumn of the year before last, on a matter I have had cause to think of since, and its date is a thing I might one day need to establish. And when that day comes, Mrs. Hudson, and I find that the single object capable of establishing it has been burnt for tidiness, I shall bear the loss with a fortitude I would ask you to remember and regret." Mrs. Hudson considered this. She'd come down off the little steps she used to reach the higher shelves, and she stood now with a duster over her shoulder and a look on her face of great and patient calm, and she said, "Mr. Holmes, in the 11 years you have lodged in this house, how many times have you had occasion to establish the date of a journey by means of a ticket kept in a tobacco jar?" There was a pause. "The circumstance has not yet arisen," said Holmes, "which is precisely why I keep the ticket. Preparedness is not vindicated by the past, Mrs. Hudson. It is vindicated by the future, which has not happened yet, and against which the prudent man lays in his tickets." "Then you may keep this one," said Mrs. Hudson, "in a drawer like a Christian, and not stuffed in among the shag where it flavours your smoke with cardboard." And she took the ticket from Watson's fingers, and the collar stud with it, and the dead match she dropped without ceremony into the grate, where it lay among the ash and was not mourned. The ticket and the stud she carried to the writing table and placed in the shallow drawer, and shut the drawer, and the matter was closed. And Holmes, in the window seat, watched his ticket vanish into legitimate storage with the expression of a man watching a friend emigrate to a respectable but distant colony. Watson turned the empty jar over the wastebasket and knocked its side, and the old shag came out in a soft grey fall, and the draught caught some of it and spun it, and a fine haze of very old tobacco rose into the bar of sunlight that now lay across the middle of the carpet and hung there, turning, gold against the shadow of the room, each particle of it distinct and slow and going nowhere in any hurry. Holmes watched that too. He watched the dust of his own smoking climb into the light and drift, and something in the set of his shoulders eased, and Watson, who knew him, understood that whatever else this upheaval was costing the man, the spectacle of the room's long-hoarded past being lifted into visible suspension and shown to him grain by grain was, to a mind built as his was built, not a punishment at all, but a kind of entertainment he would have paid to see and could not have staged for himself. "The slipper," said Mrs. Hudson. "Ah," thought Watson, "the slipper." The Persian slipper lived at the near end of the mantel, its heel toward the wall and its long curled toe pointing out into the room, and it was, of all the room's institutions, perhaps the one most nearly beyond challenge. It held the tobacco that was in current use, the working supply as distinct from the reserve in the jar, and it held it in its toe, packed down soft, and it had held it there for so many years that the leather had taken on the smell so deeply that the slipper would have smelled of shag if you had emptied it, aired it, and left it out in the rain for a week. It was not a beautiful object. The embroidery on its instep had gone dull, and the sole had parted from the upper along one side so that it gaped a little when lifted, like a thing about to speak. But it was Holmes's, and it was where the tobacco was, and to propose to clean it was to propose something very near the centre of the household's private religion. "You may empty it," said Holmes from the window seat in a voice from which all the earlier playfulness had gone, "and you may brush it, and you may return the tobacco to it afterward, and I will thank you not to wash it. It has never been washed. Its virtue is in never having been washed. Water would be," he searched for the word, "a desecration." "I had not proposed to wash it," said Mrs. Hudson with dignity. "I am not a barbarian, Mr. Holmes. I propose to empty it and brush it and return the tobacco, which is precisely what you have described, and I am glad we are agreed." And she said it in such a way that it was impossible to tell whether she had ever intended anything else, or had simply, with great economy, allowed him to believe he had won a battle she had not been fighting. Watson suspected the latter. He was coming, over the course of this single morning, to a new and increased respect for their landlady's tactical gifts, which he had always known were considerable but had never before watched deployed across so wide a front and against so difficult a subject. He carried the slipper to the table, he tipped it, and the tobacco came out of the toe in a single soft compressed mass that broke apart as it fell, and the smell of it, fresher than the jars, this being the tobacco actually in use, rose up strong and dark and immediate, and for a moment Watson was not in the sunlit sitting room at all, but in 100 evenings of it, 100 nights. Of Holmes filling a pipe from this slipper, and the room going blue with smoke and some problem turning over between them in the lamplight while the fire settled and the last cab of the night went by below. A smell will do that. It will take a man out of the morning he's standing in and set him down in every evening he has ever spent all at once, and then let him go again, gently, and leave him standing where he was with a slipper in his hand and no idea how long he's been silent. "Doctor," said Mrs. Hudson. "Here," said Watson, and brushed the last of the tobacco free and turned the slipper over and knocked it softly the way Mrs. Hudson had knocked the books, and out of the toe of it, along with the final crumbs of shag, there fell onto the table a single small hard object that rang once against the wood and lay still. They all three looked at it. It was a cufflink. One cufflink, single, its partner nowhere. A small oval of some pale metal, silver perhaps, or something wanting to be silver, with a design worked into its face that the dust of the slipper had half filled so that Watson could not at first make it out. It was not Holmes's. Watson knew Holmes's cufflinks, the plain gold ones and the mother-of-pearl ones he wore when a case required him to be respectable, and this was neither. It was not, so far as Watson knew, anybody's. It had simply been in the toe of the slipper, under the tobacco, for some length of time no one could now determine, and it had come out into the April light on the 14th day of the month with the air of a thing that had been waiting a good while to be found and was not entirely sure it was pleased about it. "That," said Holmes, "is not mine." "No," said Watson. "I've never owned a cufflink of that pattern." "No," said Watson again, turning it in the light. The dust in the design shifted, and for a moment he thought he saw a shape in it, a small worked figure or a monogram, but the sun was behind him, and his own shadow fell across the table, and he could not be sure. He set it down. It was a small thing, and a stray cufflink in a bachelor establishment is very nearly the least remarkable object the world can produce, and any sensible man would have swept it into the colony of the saved and thought no more about it. And yet Watson found, setting it down, that he did not quite want to look away from it, and that he could not have told you why, and that the not being able to tell you why was itself the interesting part. Holmes said nothing at all, which was in its way the most interesting thing of the morning, because Holmes, faced with a small anomaly, a strange object in a strange place, was constitutionally incapable of leaving it alone. It was the whole engine of the man. Show him a cufflink that ought not to be where it was, and he would be across the room and over it with his glass before you had finished setting it down, reading its metal and its wear and its maker, and reconstructing from it the entire history of the hand that had lost it. That was what he did. That was what he was for, and here was exactly such an object. A single cufflink of unknown provenance surfacing from the toe of his own slipper, and Holmes, in the window seat in the hole of the sun, sat and looked at it and did not move and did not speak, and did not ask to see it closer, and the silence where his curiosity should have been was so unlike him that Watson glanced across at his friend to see whether he was well. Holmes was looking at the cufflink. His face had gone very still. Not the theatrical stillness he sometimes wore for effect, the stillness that was a kind of performance of thought, but a plainer thing, a settling, as of a man who has recognised something and is deciding in the same instant that he will not appear to have recognised it. It lasted no longer than a breath or two. Then he looked away, out of the window, into the street, at nothing, and said, in a voice of studied lightness, "Some visitors, no doubt. Half of London has passed through this room. A man loses a cufflink and never knows where, and it turns up years later in the last place he would think to look, and there is nothing in it but the ordinary carelessness of the human race. Put it in the drawer, Watson. It signifies nothing." Watson put it in the drawer, but he noted, because he had spent a long time now in the company of a man who taught you whether you wished it or not to notice things, he noted that Holmes had said years later, though nobody had said how long the cufflink had lain in the slipper. and he noted that Holmes had looked at a small dusty object from across a room, and pronounced with confidence that it signified nothing, which was not a thing Holmes said, ever, about anything, the whole of his life being one long argument that nothing signified nothing. And he noted the small deliberate lightness in the voice, the care taken to sound careless, which in a man so precise was as loud as a shout. He noted all this, and filed it, in the way Holmes had taught him to file things, and he said nothing, because it was a morning for cleaning and not for questions, and because some part of him understood already that the question, whatever it was one his friend did not wish to be asked. "Well," said Mrs. Hudson, who had watched the whole small exchange and drawn from it, Watson suspected rather more than she let on, "the slipper is emptied, and it is not washed, and it will be brushed and filled and back on the mantel by luncheon, and the world has not ended." And she took up the slipper and a soft brush, and began to work the leather, and the brush went whisk, whisk, whisk against the embroidery in a small steady rhythm that joined the tick of the clock and the roll of the wheels, and her own resumed humming, and the fabric of the morning sound wove itself closed again over the little snag the cufflink had made in it. It was some while after this, the sun having moved another hand's breadth, the mantle by now nearly cleared, the marble showing its true colour for the first time in years, that Mrs. Hudson brought out the beeswax. She brought it in a flat round tin with a picture of a bee on the lid, worn nearly to a ghost, and she brought a folded cloth soft with age, and she set them on the newly cleared end of the mantle and opened the tin, and the smell came up out of it and changed the room. It was a warm smell, and a clean one, honeyed and faintly resinous, the smell of church pews and of Sunday, and of some deep old idea of home that lived apparently in the wax of bees, and it rose up into the sunlight, and met the last of the tobacco haze, and the April air coming through the windows, and the three smells lay over one another in the warm bright room, and the effect of it was such that Watson stopped again, and this time Mrs. Hudson did not tell him to go on. She took a little of the wax on the cloth, and began to work it into the marble in slow circles, and under her hand the stone came up dark and living where it had been dull and grey, a deep shine rising out of it as though the shine had been there all along, under the years, waiting for someone to have the patience to bring it back. She worked in silence now, having let the humming lapse, and the only sounds were the wheels in the street, and the slow, round, round, round of the cloth on the stone, and the clock, and it came to Watson, watching, that there was a kind of care in the motion of her hand that had nothing to do with tidiness, and everything to do with tending, that she was not cleaning the mantle so much as she was restoring it, giving back to a good piece of stone the dignity that neglect had taken from it, and that she would have done exactly the same for the mantle of a duke or a costermonger, because the care was in her and not in the object, and the object was only where it happened to land. Holmes watched her too. He had turned from the window and was watching the wax go into the marble, the shine come up, and whatever had crossed his face at the sight of the cufflink had gone from it now, and left behind only a kind of thoughtful ease, a man at rest in the sun watching good work well done. "You will make the rest of the room ashamed of itself," he said, at last, quietly, and there was no edge in it. "That is the general idea," said Mrs. Hudson. "When you have finished," said Holmes, "the mantle will be the most respectable object in the establishment, and it will look about itself at the company it keeps, and it will not know what it has done to deserve us." "It will get used to us," said Mrs. Hudson. "Everything does." And she worked the last of the wax into the last dull corner of the marble, and stood back and looked at what she had done, and the mantle shone in the April light, dark and warm and deep, cleared of its decade of postponements, the letters gone and the jar emptied and the slipper brushed and only the clock left standing on it, ticking, keeping its steady time over the restored stone as it had kept it over the ruined stone, indifferent, faithful, the one thing in the room that had never needed cleaning because it had never once stopped working. Down in the street the wheels rolled on. A cab this time, lighter than the wagon, its two wheels ticking over the setts in a quick uneven rhythm that rose and passed and faded toward the park, and behind it the ordinary murmur closed in again, and the room stood in its 2 bars of moving sunlight with one surface finished and the whole of the rest of itself still to do. And Mrs. Hudson folded her waxing cloth and set it down, and drew the long breath of a woman a quarter of the way through a large task and looked, next with a considering eye, at the carpet. "The rugs," she said, "will have to come up." Holmes, in the window seat, closed his eyes against the sun and smiled very slightly and said nothing, which everyone present understood to mean that the disorder had, on this point, entirely given up its defence. The letters had been Watson's charge from the first, and now, with the mantle cleared and shining and the jar and slipper settled, there was nothing to be done but face them. He had gathered them into a single loose heap on the cleared end of the table, the whole fan of them that had lived skewered under the jackknife, together with a further stratum he had turned up behind the clock, and a third pocket of them wedged down the side of Holmes's chair, so that what had been 3 or 4 separate colonies of postponement on the mantle became, on the table, one continent of it. He looked at the heap. It was, he estimated, the correspondence of something better than a year of Baker Street's business, of clients and cranks and creditors, and the ordinary sediment of a life lived at an address people wrote to. And it had all of it been received, and read, or half read, or not read at all, and then driven on to the point of the knife, and left to become part of the room, and now it was to be gone through, letter by letter, in the April light, and mostly burned. "You will read them out," said Mrs. Hudson, who had taken up a station by the grate with the small brass shovel and the intention of feeding the fire, "and Mr. Holmes will say whether they are to be kept or burned, and if he cannot decide inside of a reasonable time they will be burned regardless, because we have not got all the year." She glanced at the window seat. "Is that agreeable, Mr. Holmes?" "It is not agreeable," said Holmes, "but it is inevitable, which I have learned this morning to treat as the same thing." So they began. The fire had been let down to almost nothing while the room was worked. A low red bed of coals with no flame to it, and Mrs. Hudson laid on a first small shovelful, and the flame came back with a soft rush, and settled to a steady burning, and it was into that steady burning that the letters went one after another, as the morning wore on toward noon. And the fire made its own sound under everything else, not loud, but constant, a low crackle and tick and occasional soft collapse, as a coal gave way, and paper on it flared with a brief rushing whisper and was gone, and this sound joined the others, the clock and the wheels and the street through the open windows, and became the newest thread in the fabric of the day, the thread that ran through the whole long business of the correspondence. The small hungry whisper of the fire taking a year of Baker Street apart, page by page, and turning it into warmth and ash, and a thin grey smoke that the draught from the windows pulled up the chimney and away over the roofs of Marylebone. Watson lifted the first letter and unfolded it. "A Mrs. Cattermole," he read, "of Pinner. She writes that her neighbour's chimney smokes into her scullery on a north wind, and that she has reason to believe it is done on purpose, and she encloses a diagram." "Burn it," said Holmes without opening his eyes. "There is a second page." "Burn the second page with the first. Mrs. Cattermole's neighbour is guilty of nothing but a badly sighted flu, and the great human wish to be persecuted by someone. I declined the case in November, and she has written twice since, into the fire with all 3, and may her scullery clear." Watson passed the pages to Mrs. Hudson, and Mrs. Hudson laid them on the coals, and the fire took them with a soft rush. The diagram and all, and Mrs. Cattermole's grievance rose up the chimney in a curl of smoke and was at an end. And there was, Watson found, a small clean satisfaction in it that he had not expected, a lightness, letter by letter, as the heap on the table shrank and the room shed a year of things it had been carrying without meaning to. He had thought the business would be tedious. It was tedious in a way, but it was the good kind of tedium, the kind with an end visibly approaching and a warm result, and the fire whispered, and the clock ticked, and the wheels rolled in the street, and one by one the small dead concerns of the previous year went up in their thin grey smoke. They made, between them, a rhythm of it. Watson would lift a letter and unfold it and read the sender and the sum of the thing. Holmes, from the window seat, eyes closed, face up to the sun, would pronounce, "Burn it, keep it, burn it, burn it, read me the last line of that one, burn it," with the smooth practised speed of a man sorting a hand of cards he has seen 100 times before. And Mrs. Hudson would feed the grate, and the fire would take what it was given, and they would move on to the next. And through it Holmes recited, half to himself, the small histories of the correspondence, so that the burning became a kind of inventory of the year, spoken aloud once as each item was destroyed, as though a thing had to be named before it could be let go. "A gentleman in Norwood who believes his wife's canary is being coached to inform against him," said Watson. "Burn it. He was quite mad and very polite about it. I sent him to a physician, and he sent me a hamper, the hamper I kept, the letter you may destroy. A firm of solicitors regarding a matter they decline to specify. Burn it. When a firm of solicitors declines to specify the matter, Watson, it is because the matter is that they have not been paid, and they are hoping to be, and they will write again in a plainer hand when hope has worn thin. That is not a case. That is a dunning letter in a good coat," the fire whispered. A coal broke and settled with a small soft fall, and a spray of sparks went up the black throat of the chimney and out, and Mrs. Hudson leaned in with the shovel and squared the bed of it, and laid on a little more, and the flame steadied. Below, in the street, the middle of the day was building toward its height. More feet on the pavement now, more voices, the rattle of a hansom setting down a fare at a door along the row, and the driver's low word to his horse, and once, clear and sudden through both open windows, the bright brass bark of a barrel organ starting up 2 corners off, a jaunty, broken little tune that played for a minute and a half and then moved on, dragging its music away down the streets with it until the distance swallowed it, and the ordinary murmur came back. Holmes had opened one eye at the organ. "There is a man," he said, "who has been playing that same tune, in that same key, a semitone flat for as long as I have lived in this house, and I have never once seen his face, and I should know his elbow anywhere in London." Then he closed the eye again, and the burning went on. It was perhaps a third of the way down the heap, the fire well established now, the ash beginning to build grey at the back of the grate, the smell of burnt paper laid warm over the beeswax and the tobacco and the April air, that Watson unfolded a letter and did not read it out at once. He had not meant to pause. But the hand on this one was different from the others, not a client's careful copper plate, nor a solicitor's clerkly slope, nor a madman's cramped urgency, but a light, quick, educated hand. A woman's, he thought, written in haste but without agitation, the hand of someone accustomed to writing and to being understood. The paper was good, and had been folded small and carried, he saw, before it was ever sent. There was a soft wear at the folds that came from a pocket, not a post-bag. And the date at the head of it was old. Older than the year of correspondence around it. It had wandered somehow into this heap from further back, from some earlier drift, and lodged there, and been driven onto the knife with the rest, and it did not belong to the same season as its neighbours at all. "Well," said Mrs. Hudson, shovel ready. "A moment," said Watson. He read the first lines to himself, and then, because he had been enlisted to read them out and saw no reason yet not to, he began to read it aloud. "It begins, my dear Mr. Holmes, I would not trouble you again after your great kindness, and I write not to reopen what is closed, but only to—" "Give me that," said Holmes. He was out of the window seat before Watson had well registered that he had moved, across the room in 3 strides with the sun sliding off his shoulders as he came out of it, and he took the letter out of Watson's hands not roughly but with a completeness that allowed no continuation, folded it once along its worn folds and stood holding it, and the room, which had been going along so easily on its rhythm of red and burn, came to a small full stop. The fire whispered on. The clock ticked, but the 3 people in the room had gone still, and the stillness had a different quality from the comfortable pauses of the morning. It was the stillness that comes when someone has moved faster than the moment called for, and everyone present understands, without a word, that they have brushed up against something with an edge to it. "I beg your pardon," said Watson. "No," said Holmes. "No, it is I. Forgive me. I spoke too." He stopped. He looked down at the folded letter in his hand, and for a moment the studied lightness he had put on over the cufflink was nowhere about him. There was only a man holding a piece of paper he had not expected to see again, in the middle of a sunlit room, with 2 people watching him, and a fire waiting to be fed. "This one," he said more evenly, "I will keep." "Then keep it," said Mrs. Hudson, "and welcome. You are entitled to keep what you like, Mr. Holmes. It is your correspondence and your fire. I only feed what I am given." And she said it gently, more gently than she had said anything all morning, and she turned back to the grate and laid on a small shovelful, and made herself busy with the coals, giving him, in the only way the moment allowed, a little privacy in a room where there was none to be had, the courtesy of not being looked at. Holmes crossed to the writing table. He opened the shallow drawer, the same drawer that now held the railway ticket and the collar stud and the single cufflink from the toe of the slipper, and he laid the folded letter in it, on top of the rest, and Watson, who happened to be facing that way and could not help what his eyes did, saw the letter come to rest directly upon the cufflink, the two of them together in the drawer, and saw Holmes's hand pause over them both for the smallest part of a second before he slid the drawer shut. It was nothing. It was a man putting a letter away in a drawer that happened to contain a cufflink. And yet Watson, who had been taught by this same man over years of patient and unwanted instruction to distrust the word nothing, felt the two objects settle together in his mind the way they had settled together in the drawer and could not quite make them come apart again. He said none of this. He picked up the next letter. A Colonel Merridew's man of business, he read, regarding a debt of honour said to be owing, and his voice was quite ordinary, and the morning gathered itself and went on. But it went on changed a little. Holmes did not go back to the window seat. He stood by the writing table a while, and then he took to moving about the room, not helping exactly, for he had been forbidden to help, but drifting, lifting a book here and setting it down there, standing at the open window with his back to them, looking down into the street where the barrel organ had been, coming back. He had the air of a man whose thoughts had been set going by something, and would not settle, and Watson knew that air of old and knew better than to disturb it, and read out his letters, and Mrs. Hudson fed her fire, and the two of them between them carried the work along its steady way, while the third of the party paced the edges of it with his mind 3 years and some months elsewhere. "That one," said Holmes suddenly, coming back to himself, indicating a letter in Watson's hand. "The Merridew man. Burn it. The debt was paid, and paid twice over, by a party who wished it thought unpaid, for reasons that did him great credit, and that I am not at liberty to set down. There is a kind of man, Watson." And he was talking now, easily, in the flow of it, in the way he did when a thought wanted saying, and the saying of it steadied him. There is a kind of man who does a good thing and cannot bear to be seen to have done it, who pays another man's debt in the dark and lets the world go on believing it unpaid, and lets himself be thought hard, or forgetful, or worse, rather than stand in the light and be thanked. It is a vanity, of a sort. But it is the rarest and the most forgivable of the vanities, being the only one that costs the man who holds it more than it profits him. He stopped. He seemed to hear, a beat late, how far he had gone from a solicitor's letter about a colonel. "Burn it," he said again, more shortly. "It is stale." Mrs. Hudson burned it, and she said to the fire in the mild tone of a woman making an observation about the weather, "You would know a good deal about that kind of man, I expect, Mr. Holmes." "I have met one or two," said Holmes. "I dare say you have," said Mrs. Hudson, and laid on another coal and said no more. And Watson, glancing between them, had the distinct sensation of two people conducting, over the top of a fire and around the edges of a heap of letters, a conversation whose real subject was not in any of the words of it, and to which he did not have the key. It was not an uncomfortable sensation. There was warmth in it, but it left him certain of a thing he had begun to suspect at the mantle and been half sure of at the slipper, that this ordinary morning of cleaning had turned up, somewhere among the dust and the postponements, a matter with a history to it, and that his friend and his landlady both knew what that matter was, and that he did not, and that he was not, for the present, going to be told. He let it be. That was a thing he had learned too in his years at Baker Street, perhaps the most useful thing of all, more useful than any trick of observation, to let a thing be when a thing wanted letting be, to trust that what needed saying would be said in its own time, by the person whose time it was, and to fill the waiting meanwhile with useful work and good company and no questions. So he lifted the next letter, and the next, and the heap on the table went down, and the ash in the grate went up, and the fire whispered, and the clock ticked, and the wheels rolled in the street, and the long business of the correspondence carried on toward its end through the middle of the day. And they were nearly at the bottom of it, a dozen letters left, no more, when Watson unfolded one that made him smile, and read it out for the pleasure of it rather than any doubt of its fate. A client, a Miss Somebody of Streatham, writing some months after her case was closed, not with a new trouble, but simply to say that the thing Holmes had found for her had made all the difference, and that she thought of it kindly, and hoped he was well, and had enclosed — the enclosure was long gone, but the letter named it — a pressed flower from her own garden, by way of thanks. "She sounds," said Watson, "like a woman who was grateful and said so and thought no more of it, which is rarer than it ought to be." "It is very rare," said Holmes, "and it is why I keep her letter and not the flower, which was a marigold and did not survive the acquaintance of my chemistry. Keep it." And Watson set it in the small colony of the saved, smaller by far than the colony of the burned. And there was, in the keeping of that one plain kind letter, out of all the year's traffic of grievance and greed and canaries suspected of espionage, a small warmth that seemed to sum the morning up, that of everything a life accumulates and drives onto the point of a knife and means to deal with later. The little that is worth keeping is nearly always the little that was kindly meant. The last letters went quickly. Burn, burn, keep, burn. And then the table was clear of them, and the heap was gone, and where a year of Baker Street had lain there was only bare wood, and a faint scatter of dust that Watson wiped away with his yellow cloth, and in the grate the fire burned low and warm on its bed of grey ash, well fed, replete, and the smell of burnt paper thinned and lifted, and let the beeswax and the April air come back through. Mrs. Hudson set down her shovel and straightened her back with the small sigh of a job seen through, and looked at the cleared table, and nodded once and said, "There, a year lighter, and none the poorer for it." And Watson thought that was very near exactly right, and did not say so, because it did not need saying. Holmes had gone back to the window at some point in the last of it, and stood now with his hands. Behind him, looking down into Baker Street, where the day was at its full noon height, the pavements busy, the wheels steady, the light hard and clean on the fronts of the houses opposite. He was quiet, and it was a settled quiet now. The disturbance of the letter worked through and put away with the letter itself in the shallow drawer. But once, while Watson watched, he half turned his head back toward the writing table, toward the drawer, as though to reassure himself of something there. And then he turned again to the window and to the street, and to whatever it was he was thinking, and behind him the fire ticked down toward embers, and the clock kept its time over the shining mantel, and below the two open windows the great ordinary river of the city rolled on and on through the middle of the day, carrying its wheels and its voices and its one-barrel organ, a semitone flat somewhere far off now and going further, playing its broken tune to streets that had not heard it yet. The rugs, Mrs. Hudson had said, would have to come up, and coming up they were. There were 3 of them in the sitting-room, the great turkey red that lay across the centre and took the traffic of the day, a smaller Persian by the hearth gone thin at its middle, where 2 pairs of feet had crossed it 10,000 times, and a plain drab runner in the doorway that nobody had ever admired, and everybody had wiped their boots on. And between the cold smoke of a London winter, and the tobacco of a Baker Street one, and the general going on of 2 men, and their visitors, and their chemistry, and their dog, the 3 of them together held, Mrs. Hudson estimated, the better part of 100 weight of dust that had no business remaining in a room she had undertaken to clean. It could not be swept out of them. It had to be beaten out of them, and beaten out of them it could not be in the sitting-room. On pain of undoing every stroke of work already done, it had to go down to the yard. So the furniture was moved back to the walls, and here the second of the day's sound motifs came at last into its own. The long complaining scrape of heavy things dragged across bare boards, the settee and the 2 armchairs and the little table shoved and hauled and walked corner over corner to the room's edges, each of them protesting in its own register, a low groan from the settee, a sharp bark from the table's iron-shod foot, until the centre of the floor stood clear for the first time in memory, a wide, pale expanse of board with the ghost shapes of the departed rugs printed on it, in clean rectangles where the dust of years had not reached. Watson stood a moment looking at those clean rectangles, the negative image of the room's whole furniture, the map of where things had been. Then he bent, with Mrs. Hudson at the other end, and they rolled the great turkey red from both sides toward its middle, and it came up off the floor heavy and reluctant as a sleeping animal, and released as it lifted a low breath of dust that hung in the afternoon light and turned. "Down the back stairs," said Mrs. Hudson, "and mind the turn at the bottom, for it is narrower than it looks, and I have seen a rug win an argument with a man on that turn before now." They carried it down. It was awkward work. The rolled rug was long and heavy at its heart, and it wanted to sag in the middle and swing at its ends, and the stairs were dim after the bright room and turned twice on themselves before they let out at the back of the house. And Watson went first, backward, feeling for each tread with his heel, and Mrs. Hudson came after with the greater share of the weight and no complaint about it, and their 4 feet on the bare wood of the back stairs made between them a broken, uneven, effortful drumming, a thud, thud, pause, thud of 2 people managing a load down a difficult descent, that carried up the stairwell and into the empty sitting room where Holmes stood at the window and could hear it. Footsteps on stairs. It was a sound the house made a dozen times a day and no one ever marked. But marked now, with the room stripped bare and the afternoon settling, it had a homely rhythm to it. The sound of a house being kept, of work going on in it, of people carrying things up and down, the way people had carried things up and down that same stair since the house was raised. The yard, when they came out into it, was a small square of London that the sun had found. It lay. Behind the house, hemmed on its 3 far sides by the backs of other houses and the walls of their yards, a modest paved space of flagstones gone soft-edged with age, with a water-butt in one corner, and a boot-scraper by the door, and a length of stout rope strung between 2 iron hooks, precisely where Mrs. Hudson wanted it, at the height of a woman's shoulder, for the beating of exactly such rugs as these. The paving was warm underfoot. Between the flags, in the seams where no broom could reach, small brave weeds had come up green with the turn of the season, and against the south wall someone long ago had trained a rose that was not yet in leaf, but had put out, on the tips of its dark canes, the first hard swollen buds of the red it would be in June. The backs of the houses rose up around the little space, brick gone black at the tops with the soot of years and warm ochre lower down where the weather had washed it. And windows here and there stood open to the afternoon, and from one of them, some houses off, came the sound of a woman singing to a child, and from another the clink and splash of washing up, and over the wall from the next yard but one the sudden brief racket of a dog who had heard them arrive and wished it known that he had. It was, Watson thought, setting down his end of the rug and straightening his back, a whole small world back here, hidden behind the tall, respectable fronts of Baker Street. A working world, the underside of the street's dignity, where the labour that kept the front rooms fit to be seen was done in the open air among the weeds and the water butts, out of sight of the callers and the cabs. He had lived at the front of this house for years and come down to its back perhaps a dozen times, and each time it surprised him, this sunlit domestic republic of yards and washing lines and open kitchen windows, going about its business behind the city's turned back. "Over the rope with him," said Mrs. Hudson, "red side out, and we shall see what the winter left us." They heaved the great rug up over the rope and settled it there, hanging its red face to the yard, and it hung heavy and still in the warm air, and Mrs. Hudson went to the wall by the door and took down from its nail the instrument of the afternoon, the carpet beater. It was a fine old thing, a broad flat paddle of woven cane worked into loops and hearts, its handle bound with cloth gone dark and smooth with the grip of years, and she took it up with the ease of long acquaintance, and hefted it once, and Watson understood, watching her, that this was an office she had held for a very long time, that she had beaten the dust out of the coverings of this house through more springs than he had lodged in it, and that she was good at it, in the way people are good at the things they have done 10,000 times without once being praised for. "You may spell me," she said, "when my arm tires, but I will start him, for there is a way of it, and you have not the way, Doctor, and I have not the patience this afternoon to teach you." And she set her feet, and drew back the beater, and struck. The sound of it was extraordinary. It was a single flat whoomp, deep and soft and enormous, the sound of a great deal of trapped air driven suddenly out of a great deal of heavy wool, and with it came a cloud. A real cloud, a grey-gold billow of dust that burst from the face of the rug and hung in the sunlight and drifted slowly off across the yard on the small movement of the afternoon air. She struck again. Whoomp! Another cloud, and the dog over the wall barking now in earnest at each report, and the beater drawn back and swung again and again, in a steady, even, unhurried rhythm, one full stroke to every 2 or 3 seconds, each one landing with that same deep, soft, enormous whump, and each one raising its cloud, so that in a little while the whole of the yard behind 221B was hazed with the drifting golden dust of the sitting-room, turning gently in the shafts of light between the houses, settling on the flagstones, dusting the swollen buds of the rose, while the woman in the middle of it swung her cane paddle with the patience of a metronome, and drove a winter out of the wool a stroke at a time. And that was the sound that ruled the rest of the afternoon. Wump, wump, wump. Steady and spaced and even, a great slow, soft heartbeat of a sound, and it carried up over the yard walls into the open windows round about, up the back of the house, and into the stripped sitting room and out, faintly, even to the front, so that a man passing along Baker Street might have caught, under the wheels and the voices, the far muffled rhythmic thud of a house being beaten clean, and thought nothing of it, for it was the sound of spring itself in that city, the sound 1,000 yards made on the first warm days, the sound of London turning its rugs out to the sun. Watson stood by the water butt and listened to it, and felt it settle into him, that steady, deep, unhurried beat, and found that his own breathing had gone slow to match it, and that the effect of it was not wearying but the opposite, that there was something in a sound so regular and so patient and so free of any urgency that eased a man down, stroke by stroke, into a state very near to peace. Up above, at the sitting-room window, a sash went up. They both looked. Holmes had appeared at the open window 2 floors above, leaning out over the sill into the afternoon, his shirt sleeves bright in the sun, and he had the air of a man who had been left alone in an empty room with nothing to supervise, and had come to the window to remedy the deficiency. "You are striking it wrong," he called down. Mrs. Hudson did not pause. "Whump! Am I?" she said to the rug. "You're striking it in the centre, where the wool is thickest and the dust least, when you should be working from the edges in, driving the dust before you toward a single quarter, from which it may be expelled entire. You are, if I may say so, beating at random. There is a science to the distribution of dust in a woven material that would repay 10 minutes' study and save you half an hour's labour." "Whump! There is a science," said Mrs. Hudson, "to a great many things, Mr. Holmes, and I have no doubt you know the whole of it, and I will tell you what I have learned in 40 years of beating carpets, which is that the dust does not know it is being studied, and comes out just the same to a plain stroke as to a clever one, and a deal sooner, if the person striking does not stop to explain herself to the neighbourhood. Whump! You were sent to a window seat this morning. You have found your way to a window. It is progress of a kind. I would ask you to enjoy the view and keep your science for the wall." There was a pause from above. Watson, by the water butt, kept his face very carefully toward the rug. "I shall time you," said Holmes, retreating to a new position. "I shall observe the rate of your strokes and the diminution of the dust cloud with each, and I shall determine the precise number of blows required to render the rug clean. And when you have struck that number, I shall inform you, and you may stop, and we shall have established the thing on a proper footing for all future occasions." "You may count what you like," said Mrs. Hudson. "I shall stop when the dust stops, which is the only number that has ever signified." Whump! And Holmes, at the window above, folded his arms upon the sill and set himself to count, and did, Watson had no doubt, count, genuinely count, with the whole of that formidable attention bent upon the falling of dust from a hanging rug, deriving from the exercise the particular satisfaction he derived from bending his mind upon any small measurable thing, and caring not at all that the counting served no purpose and would change nothing, because the counting was its own purpose and its own reward. He hung there in the sun 2 floors up, counting carpet strokes, forbidden from the work and reduced to the study of it, and he was, Watson thought, glancing up at him, about as content as a man in exile could contrive to be, which in Holmes was a good deal more content than he would ever have owned to. The beating went on. Mrs. Hudson's arm did tire in time. She was not a young woman, and it was heavy work, and the sun on the yard was warm, and Watson spelled her, taking the beater when she held it out and setting his feet, as she had set hers and swinging, and his first strokes were poor, too high or off the flat, and Holmes commented on each from the window with great precision and no mercy, until Watson found the way of it, the loose full swing from the shoulder that let the flat of the paddle land square, and then the deep, soft whump came right for him too, and he settled into the rhythm of it. Stroke and stroke and stroke, and the dust came off in its clouds, thinner now, the great gross winter of it already gone. Only the fine, deep-held remainder still working loose. And there was a satisfaction in that too, a plain bodily satisfaction he had not known he was hungry for. The swing and the impact and the cloud, the honest use of the arm and the back, the visible result of it drifting off gold across the yard, and he thought, swinging, that a man might do worse of an afternoon than this, than good plain work in the sun with a result he could see, and a friend to insult him from a window, and the whole busy hidden republic of the yards going on around him. 91, said Holmes from above at some point. 92. The cloud is now perhaps a fifth of what it was at the first stroke, from which we may extrapolate. Watson, you have missed the flat that one doesn't count, from which we may extrapolate a total requirement of something near 200 blows for the large rug alone, of which you have wasted, by my count, 11 on strokes improperly landed. He is a great help, Watson observed to Mrs. Hudson, low between swings. He's where I can see him, said Mrs. Hudson, and not underfoot in a clean room touching what he has been told to leave, and that doctor is worth more to me this afternoon than any help he could give with his hands, which are clever hands, I will grant, but not hands I would trust near a job of honest cleaning. Let him count. Counting keeps him. There has never yet been the trouble invented that Mr. Holmes could not be kept out of by the offer of something to measure. Watson laughed at that, could not help it, and the laugh cost him a stroke, the paddle glancing off the top of the rug instead of landing flat, and Holmes above said, "That one does not count either," without a flicker, and Watson leaned on the beater and laughed the harder in the warm afternoon, in the dust and the sun, and it came to him with a small surprising force how happy he was, how simply and completely happy, in this ordinary yard on this ordinary afternoon at the plainest work there was, and how little the happiness had to do with anything but the company he was in and the smallness of what they were about. They finished the great rug and hung the Persian in its place and beat that, which took less doing, being smaller and thinner, and then the drab runner, which took less still. And between the rugs, in the pauses, while one was taken down and the next slung up, the yard grew still, and its own small sounds came back into the space the beating had driven them out of. The woman singing to her child, some houses off, the same slow tune come round again, the washing up done now and a window shut on it, the dog reconciled to their presence and gone to sleep in his own yard, and under and through it all the far steady wheels of Baker Street at the front of the house, muffled by the whole depth of the building a distant tide, and Holmes at the window came, in one of these pauses, to speak of something other than the Count. There was a yard like this, he said, behind the house I lodged in when I first came up to London, Montague Street, smaller than this and darker, for it faced north and got the sun an hour a day if the year was generous. I used to do my chemistry out in it in the warm months to spare the room the fumes. The neighbours objected. He was looking down not quite at them, but past them, at the yard itself, at its walls and its weeds, and its bit of trained rose. And Mrs. Pargeter at the back. She objected to the smells, and to the reports, for some of my preparations were not stable, and once to a small quantity of a green vapour that came over her wall on an east wind, and turned her washing an interesting colour. I was very young. I had no notion then that a yard is a shared thing, that the air of it belongs to everyone whose window gives on to it, and that a man cannot conduct his affairs in it as though the walls went up to heaven. He paused. She was quite right to object. I have thought of her since, from time to time, when I have been tempted to behave as though a shared space were my own. It is a lesson a man learns young in a yard or never learns at all. Mrs. Hudson, resettling the runner over the rope, looked up at him. That, she said, is very near to an apology for a decade of chemical smells coming up my own back stairs, Mr. Holmes, and I shall treasure it, for I do not expect to hear its like again. It was not an apology, said Holmes. It was a reminiscence. You will oblige me by not confusing the two. But he said it with the ghost of a smile in it, and he stayed at the window in the sun, and did not go back to his counting. And Watson, swinging the beater at the last of the runners, thought that there had been something in the reminiscence beyond itself, that his friend's mind, set going that morning by a cuff-link and a letter, was moving among old things this afternoon, old rooms and old neighbours and old versions of himself, in the way a mind will move among its whole past when one door of it has been unexpectedly opened, and that the yard and the beating and the plain shared labour of it had somehow given that movement a place to go. The last of the dust came out of the runner. Watson hung the beater back on its nail, and the 3 rugs hung on the rope in a row in the westering sun, red and worn thin and drab, purged of their winter, lighter by 100 weight of the year, and the yard around them was haze still with the fine gold remnant of it, settling slow through the shafts of afternoon light, and the smell of the place had changed with the beating, the mustiness driven off, and in its stead the clean warm smell of sun on old wool and old stone, and under it, faint, the green smell of the weeds crushed underfoot, and the first sap rising in the canes of the rose. "They will want an hour on the rope to air," said Mrs. Hudson, wiping her hands on her apron and looking at them with satisfaction. "And then they will go back up, and the room will have them again, and be the warmer for it. There is no warmth like a rug that has had the sun in it. A cold house is a house whose rugs have not seen the summer." She looked about the little yard, at the settling dust and the hanging rugs, and the black and ochre backs of the houses, and the singing coming still from the open window some doors off, and she nodded once, the nod of a woman at a fair point in a long day's work. "We shall have our tea," she said, "while they air. And then, Doctor, there is the settee to be moved out from the wall and got it underneath, which I have been putting off, for I have not looked under that settee since the autumn, and I do not care to think what has gathered there. But that is after tea. Everything is after tea. That is the first rule of a long day's work, and the last, and I have never found occasion to add a third." They gathered up the beater and the ropes slack, and turned back toward the door, and toward the dim back stairs and the tea waiting somewhere up them. And above them, at the window, Holmes drew back at last from the sill into the room, and they heard the sash come down, and the yard was left to itself, to its hanging rugs, and its drifting dust, and its climbing sun, its one rose, and its sleeping dog, and its far-off singing, going on behind the tall turned back of the street exactly as it had gone on before they came, and would go on after. And the last of the beaten dust of the sitting-room turned gold in the light of the closing afternoon and settled, at length, quite gently, onto the warm flagstones of a small square of London that had, for an hour, held 3 people and a great deal of honest work and about as much plain contentment as an ordinary day is ever asked to hold. Tea came and went, as tea does, in a lull that the whole house seemed to observe together. They took it up in the stripped sitting-room among the furniture stood back against the walls, 3 cups on the cleared table, and for the length of it the work stopped entirely and the room rested, and so did they. The rugs aired below in the yard, the fire had burned down to a warm red bed, and through the open windows the afternoon had begun, imperceptibly to lengthen, the light coming into the room at a lower slant now, reaching further across the bare boards than it had at noon, laying a longer gold along the floor and beginning, at the tops of the houses opposite, to take on the first faint warmth of the colour it would wear at evening. They drank their tea and said little, and what they said was small and easy, and Holmes, restored to his own room and permitted for the duration of the tea to occupy a chair like a Christian, sat in one of the armchairs stood back against the wall, and looked out at the changing light, and seemed, for that half hour, wholly at peace, the disturbances of the morning work through and settled, a man at rest at the still point of a long day. Then the cups were gathered, and Mrs. Hudson rose and set her hands to the small of her back and stretched, and looked, with the air of a general returning to a postponed engagement at the settee. It stood against the long wall, where it had stood, without once being moved, for longer than anyone in the room could have said with confidence. It was a heavy old thing, horsehair under a worn covering, its feet lost in the deep pile of the room's habits, and it had the settled, rooted look of a piece of furniture that has become geological, that has been in its place so long the room has grown up around it, and the dust has drifted against its base like a snowdrift against a wall, and the very idea of it being elsewhere has come to seem faintly improper. Mrs. Hudson had not looked under it since the autumn. She had said so in the yard, and she said it again now, with the grim relish of a woman approaching the worst job of the day, and meaning to have it behind her before the light went. "Out from the wall with him," she said. "You will take that end, Doctor, and Mr. Holmes—" She paused, and reconsidered, and Watson saw her weigh, in the space of that pause, the risk of admitting Holmes to the labour against the greater risk of what he might get up to if left idle in a room full of freshly disturbed clues. "Mr. Holmes may take the other, if he will promise to move it and not to interpret it." "I make no such promise," said Holmes, rising, "but I will move it." And he took the far end, and Watson the near, and Mrs. Hudson stood clear to direct. And on her word the 2 men lifted and drew the settee out from the wall. It came with the longest, loudest, most protesting scrape of the whole day. The full weight of it, the horsehair heart of it, dragged across the bare boards where the beaten rug no longer softened anything, and the sound it made was tremendous. A deep grinding groan of wood on wood that ran the length of the room and set the window panes faintly humming. A sound with a whole slow duration to it, beginning heavy and low as the settee first gave and broke from its rooted place, rising as it came, catching once with a jolt on a raised board, and then grinding on, out and out, until it stood clear of the wall in the middle of the floor, and the sound stopped, and the room rang for a moment in the sudden absence of it. And where the settee had been there was a long low bank of dust against the skirting, grey and soft and undisturbed, the sediment of every season it had sat there, and in the bank of dust half buried the things. They all three looked. "Well," said Mrs. Hudson after a moment in the tone of a woman whose expectations, though low, have been met. "There it all is." There it all was. Watson fetched a candle, though the afternoon light was good, for the space behind the settee was deep and shadowed, and by its light and the slanting sun together, they began to bring the finds out one by one, and lay them along the cleared table in a row, and the row grew as they worked, and the laying of it out had, without anyone intending it, the character of an exhibit, each object set down beside the last, spaced, considered, so that what had been a random drift of lost things behind a settee became, on the table, a kind of ordered display, a small museum of the room's forgetting. The first thing out was a railway guide. It was a Bradshaw, the fat monthly volume of railway timetables that every travelling Englishman knew and cursed, thick as a brick and printed in a type that ruined eyes, the indispensable and infuriating companion of any journey by rail in the kingdom. This one had gone soft with damp and age, its paper covers curled and foxed, its spine broken, and Watson lifted it out of the dust and turned to its front and read the date and said, 1885. This is a Bradshaw for the year. 85, Holmes. It has been under here 5 years. Has it? Said Holmes. He said it lightly. But Watson, setting the old guide down at the head of the row, had glanced up as he spoke, and had seen, for he was watching now, he could not help watching, the whole day having taught him to watch, had seen his friend's eyes go to the Bradshaw and rest on it for a moment with the same still attention, the same held and careful quality that they had turned on the cufflink that morning. It was there and gone. Holmes looked away, out at the light. But it had been there, and Watson had seen it, and he set the old railway guide down at the head of the row and thought, that is 2. The next things out were smaller and sadder and more numerous. Cigarette ends, a great many of them. Watson gathered them into his palm as he found them, from the dust, from the deep corner, from a fold of the settee's underside where they had fallen and lodged, and he brought them out by the handful and set them in a small drift of their own on the table. And when he had them all, he counted them, for it seemed a thing that wanted counting, and there were 41. 41 cigarette ends of a common cheap make, smoked down hard and stubbed and dropped or flicked toward the fire, and fallen short and rolled behind the settee over some length of time no one could reckon, the record in ashen paper of some long ago vigil or series of vigils, some stretch of hours or nights when a man had sat on that settee and smoked one cigarette after another and let the ends fall where they would. Not mine, said Holmes before anyone had asked. I do not smoke cigarettes as a rule, and never that make. Some clients. A man who waited, and smoked while he waited, and was nervous, by the rate of them. He checked himself, and his mouth closed on the deduction he had begun, and he finished more flatly. Some clients, it is of no consequence. Sweep them up. But Watson did not sweep them up. He left them in their small grey drift on the table next to the Bradshaw, because it had become, without discussion, the rule of the exhibit that nothing was to be swept up until all of it was out and laid in the row, and he went back to the space behind the settee and reached into the far dark corner of it with the candle held close, and his fingers found, in the deep dust, a small hard cold thing, and he brought it out into the light, and it was a cufflink. He knew it before he had it fully into the light. He knew it by the weight and the shape of it in his fingers, and when he opened his hand under the candle, there it was. The pale oval, the pattern worked into its face, the same, unmistakably and exactly the same, as the one that had fallen that morning from the toe of the Persian slipper. The pair to it. The lost partner. Here, under the settee, 5 years deep in the dust, not 3 feet from where its fellow had lain hidden in the slipper all this while. The two of them separated by the width of a room, and reunited now on the 14th of April by the plain accident of a spring cleaning, brought together on a cleared table in the afternoon light for the first time, perhaps, since the hand that wore them both had come apart from the both of them. Watson set it down beside the Bradshaw in the row, and did not say anything at once. He was looking at it, and he was aware, in the manner one is aware of weather changing, that behind him the room had gone very still. He turned. Holmes was standing quite motionless at the head of the table, looking down at the cuff-link Watson had just laid in the row, and beyond it, Watson understood, to the drawer of the writing table where its partner lay, in the dark, upon a folded letter. The lightness was gone off him. He was not performing anything now. He stood and looked at the small pale object in the row of found things, with an expression Watson had seen on his face only rarely, and never over a chemical or a clue. An expression that had nothing of the hunt in it, no eagerness, no calculation, but only a kind of quiet, arrested recognition. The look of a man who has turned a corner. He walks every day and come, without warning, full upon his own past standing there in the road. "There is its pair," said Watson gently, because something had to be said, and that was the plainest true thing there was to say. "Yes," said Holmes, "there is its pair." And that was all he said. Mrs. Hudson, by the fire, had stopped her work and stood with the small brass shovel idle in her hand, and she too was looking at Holmes, not at the cuff-link, and there was on her face none of the surprise that was surely on Watson's own. There was instead something that Watson could only read as a kind of sorrowful confirmation, the look of a person who has known a thing for a long time, and watched this afternoon the accidents of a cleaning bring it slowly up into the light where it must at last be looked at. She knew. Whatever this was, the cuff-links, the letter, the old Bradshaw, the reticence Holmes had worn all day over some matter. Of 5 years past, she knew what it was, and she had known, and she said nothing, because it was not hers to say. And she and Watson stood at their two ends of the room, while the man between them looked at a cuff-link and was, for a moment, somewhere else entirely. Then Holmes drew a breath, and the moment let him go, and he said, in a voice from which he had deliberately smoothed everything but a mild and ordinary interest, "Well, the room gives up its history. That is the danger of cleaning, Watson. One sets out to remove the dust and finds one has removed the years with it, and there they all are, laid out on the table, whether one wished to see them again or not." He looked at the row of things, the Bradshaw, the cigarette ends, the reunited cuff-link. "Is that the whole of it, or does the settee keep more?" "There is one thing more," said Watson, "in the wall." For he had seen it, kneeling with the candle, had seen it while his eyes were down at the level of the skirting where they never ordinarily went. Low on the wall, behind where the settee's arm had stood, at just the height a candle held near the floor would catch it, there was the small dent in the plaster that his eye had snagged on that very morning at the mantel and not remembered, the little crater no bigger than a thumb, the 3 thin cracks running from it like spokes, the grey dust settled in the cracks. He had seen it that morning and not known it. He knew it now. He had lived in this room for years, and he knew, the way one knows a thing that has been in front of one all along, and suddenly resolves, exactly what had made that mark and when and who had fired the shot. "Ah," said Holmes. "The wall," said Watson. "You put a bullet in the wall, I remember it. It was—" He cast back, and it came to him, the whole dull afternoon of it. It was a wet week, years ago, a stretch of days with no case and no weather and nothing whatever to do, and you were— He chose the word carefully. You were out of temper, and you took the revolver, and you fired at— He had thought, at the time, that Holmes had been picking out a pattern, initials in the plaster. He could not now recall whether the pattern had ever been finished. You fired into the wall, once or twice, to relieve your feelings, and I protested, and Mrs. Hudson protested a great deal more, and then a case came, and the wall was forgotten, and the settee was moved in front of it, and— He looked at the small grey dent low on the pale plaster, 5 years scarred over. "And there it has been, all this while, behind the settee, where no one could see it, and everyone forgot it." "Where I could not see it," said Holmes, "and so did not have to remember it. Which was, I imagine, why the settee went there in the first place. Mrs. Hudson, did you move the settee in front of that wall all those years ago on purpose, that I should not have to look at what I'd done to your plaster?" Mrs. Hudson considered the question. "I moved it," she said, because the room was better arranged so, and because a hole in a wall is a melancholy thing to have to look at every day, whoever made it, and a man out of temper enough to fire a pistol into his own lodgings is a man who does not need his temper laid out in front of him on the plaster for a reminder every time he lifts his eyes. So yes, Mr. Holmes, I moved it on purpose, and I have said nothing about it for 5 years, and I would have said nothing for 5 more if this cleaning had not brought it out, as a cleaning brings everything out in the end. She set down the shovel. That is what a cleaning is, Doctor, she said, turning to Watson, and there was something almost tender in it. It is not the dust. Anyone can move dust. It is that you cannot lift a room without lifting everything the room has been kind enough to hide for you. The settee comes out from the wall, and there is the year you would rather not think of waiting behind it, exactly where you left it. There was a silence then, in the long slant of the afternoon light, and into that silence, for the first time all day, the clock made itself heard. It had been there the whole while, of course, ticking on the shining mantle through the morning of the letters and the noon of the tea and the afternoon of the rugs. But there had always been something over it, the street, the fire, the beater, the scrape of the furniture, the talk. Now, in the stripped and settled room with the beating done below and the windows letting in only the low murmur of a street gone quieter toward evening, with the 3 of them stood still around a table of found things and no one speaking, the clock came up through the quiet and was suddenly the loudest thing in the room. Tick, 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 steady and small and patient and entirely indifferent to the cufflinks and the Bradshaw and the bullet in the wall and the 5 years and the man standing over them. The clock that had ticked through the making of every one of these small histories and would tick through their laying to rest, keeping its own even time over the whole slow business of a life accumulating and shedding its objects. The one thing in the room that had never needed cleaning because it had never once stopped, or looked back, or minded. Watson listened to it. It seemed to him, in that moment, the truest sound in the house, truer than the wheels, truer than the beater, truer even than the fire. The plain, small ongoing tick of time going on regardless, under everything, carrying them all forward at its even pace, whether they attended to it or not, out of the afternoon and toward the evening, out of the year that had come up from behind the settee and back toward the ordinary present, where the row of found things waited on the table to be understood. "Well," said Holmes at last quietly over the ticking. "There they all are then, the Bradshaw and the cigarettes, and the 2 halves of a cufflink and the mark in the wall." He looked along the row, the whole small salvage of the afternoon, laid out in the westering light. 4 things, out from under one settee, that have nothing whatever to do with one another. He paused, and then, so low that Watson was not sure afterward whether he had truly said it, or only seemed to, whether it had been meant for them, or only for himself. Also a stranger would suppose, and he turned, and went to the window, and stood looking out at the light going gold over the houses opposite, with his back to the table, and the row of found things and the quiet room, and behind him the clock ticked on, steady and small and patient, and the afternoon leaned, at last, toward its end. They did not at first do anything with the row of found things. They stood a while longer in the going light, and then the ordinary work reasserted itself, as ordinary work will, and there was the space behind the settee to be swept, and the long bank of dust to be lifted, and the boards to be washed where 5 years had lain on them, and they turned to it. But the row stayed on the table, at the cleared end, undisturbed, the Bradshaw at its head, the small grey drift of cigarette ends, the reunited cufflink, and, laid last beside them by Watson when he had gone over the wall with a damp cloth, and could not quite bring himself to wash the mark away, a little curl of the plaster dust he had loosened from the dent, standing in for the bullet itself, which was in the wall still and would stay there. 4 things, and the room worked on around them, and the light went from gold toward amber, and by degrees, in the way of a man who cannot leave a thing alone however he is resolved to, Holmes came back to them. He came back to the Bradshaw first. He took it up from the head of the row, the fat foxed guide to the year 85, and he turned its soft curled pages, and he did not read them so much as let them pass under his eyes, and he said in the low even voice of a man telling something over rather than telling it to anyone, "There is a particular page in this that is worn softer than its neighbours. Here. The tables for the Kent line, Charing Cross and Cannon Street down through the Weald. A man consults a page like this until the paper gives, when he is going somewhere he does not wish to go, over and over, and cannot make the going come right. The trains do not care how often he looks. There is no train at the hour he needs, however many times he turns to the page. He closed the guide. I bought this Bradshaw in the spring of that year for a single journey, and I made the journey, and it did not go as I had hoped, and I did not want the guide in my sight afterward, and so it went where things go that one does not want in one's sight. He set it down. Behind the settee, with the rest. Watson said nothing. He had learned that day the great use of saying nothing. Holmes moved along the row to the cigarette ends. These, he said, I told you were clients, and so they were, in a manner of speaking, though he was never quite a client, for I never quite took the case. He came here on the strength of that journey, the journey the Bradshaw was bought for, and he sat on that settee there, where it stood until an hour ago, and he smoked one after another while he told me a thing he had come a long way to tell and could hardly bear to say. 41 of them, you counted. He looked at the small grey drift. It was a long telling. He would light one and get a little way into what he had to say, and stop and smoke it down and light another and get a little further. I sat where you're standing and let him take his time, because it was the only kindness the situation left me to give him, the time to say it at his own pace, and the promise that it would go no further than this room. He paused. It has gone no further than this room. Whatever else may be said of me, that much I have kept. And now he came to the cuff-link, the one from behind the settee in the row, and he did not pick it up. He looked at it, and beyond it, and he said, he lost these here, both of them, though he never knew of but the one. He had a nervous way with his cuffs when he talked, a turning and a working at them, and one came loose and fell and rolled, and we looked for it and did not find it, and he made light of it, and went away without it, back down the Kent line on the last train, and I never saw him again, nor wished to be able to find him, for the whole of what he had come to tell me was a thing best left where he had left it. That one rolled behind the settee, and there it stayed, and the other— he glanced at last toward the drawer of the writing table. The other had worked loose without his marking it, some little while before, and I found it that same evening, after he had gone, caught in the seam of the settee's arm, and I took it up, and I could not send it after him, for I had no direction that I would use, and I could not throw it away, for it was his, and a man's, and had been dropped in trouble, and so I put it, for want of anywhere better, into the toe of the slipper, among the tobacco, where a thing may lie for years and no one think to look. And there it lay, 5 years, until this morning. And the letter, said Watson very quietly. He had not meant to speak, but it had come clear to him, the whole shape of it, the way a picture comes clear when the last piece is set, the journey, and the man who came and smoked and could hardly speak, and the trouble he brought, and the cufflinks lost in the telling, and the letter, months or years later, in a light, quick, educated hand. I would not trouble you again after your great kindness, and he could not, at the last, hold the one word back. And the letter, said Holmes. He did not turn from the window. The letter came afterward, from the person on whose account the man had made his journey, the person the whole trouble was about and for, and whose name I will not say, this evening or any evening, for the keeping of that name out of the light was the entire substance of what I did, and it is the one thing I have ever done that I am wholly certain was right, and it would be undone in the saying. He was quiet a moment. You read the first line of it aloud this morning before I stopped you. I write not to reopen what is closed, but only to, and there I took it from your hand. What it goes on to say is a thank you. That is all. A thank you, for a thing done quietly and never spoken of, from a person who had every reason to fear being spoken of and was not. I have kept it these years because— and here, for the first time all day, the even voice caught very slightly on the edge of something and steadied itself and went on. Because a man is allowed, I think, to keep one letter that tells him he did a thing right. Even a man who does not, as a rule, keep letters or need telling. The room was very still. The clock ticked on the shining mantel. Below, the street had gone quiet with the evening, the wheels grown few and far between, and through the open windows came now the small sounds of the day ending. A door closing somewhere, a bird settling, the far single toll of a church clock striking the half-hour over the roofs of Marylebone, and the three sounds of the whole long day seemed to gather themselves and come once more into the room together, softened by the evening. The last murmur of the street through the open sash, and the memory of the beater's steady thud now stilled in the aired rugs waiting below, and the long scrape of the settee moved out at last from the wall it had guarded. All of them come to rest, all of them quiet now, all of them having led, without anyone intending it, to this. An old man's trouble laid out on a clean table in the amber light, understood at last, and let be. Watson looked at the row of things. The Bradshaw, the cigarettes, the two halves of the cufflink he now knew belonged together, the mark in the wall, and saw them for the first time not as four unrelated things a settee had happened to hide, but as one thing, one single afternoon 5 years gone, broken into pieces and scattered about a room and covered over, and brought up now into the light by the plain accident of a cleaning, and fitted back together on a table by the man who had lived it. A coincidence, he had thought, when they came out one by one. It was not a coincidence. It had never been a coincidence. It had all been the one thing, all along, waiting behind the settee to be understood, and he understood too, coming to it last as he came to most things last in that room and not minding. What the whole of it had been about. Not a crime. There had been no crime. There was nothing in any of it to catch or charge or solve. There had only been a man in trouble and another person whose good name the trouble threatened, and a third man who had stepped quietly into the middle of it and taken the weight of the thing onto himself and carried it away into silence, and asked nothing, and told no one, and let himself be thought. What? Forgetful, perhaps, or hard, or simply a man who had once, in a wet and temperless week, put a bullet in his own wall for no reason that anyone could see. When all the while the reason had been there, behind the settee, in the dust, a name kept out of the light, at his own cost, and never regretted. There is a kind of man, Holmes had said that morning over the fire, of a colonel's stale debt, who does a good thing and cannot bear to be seen to have done it. Watson had thought at the time that his friend spoke of someone else. He looked across at Mrs. Hudson. She had gone on with her work through the whole of it, the sweeping, the lifting of the dust, the washing of the boards, not because she was not listening, Watson saw, but because she had heard it all before, or enough of it, or had guessed the rest long ago. Because to her none of this was a revelation, but only, at last, a saying aloud of something long known and long kept, and she gave to the saying of it the same courtesy she had given Holmes over the letter that morning, the courtesy of not making a moment of it, of letting a man tell a hard thing into a room where hands were busy and eyes were on their work and no one need be looked at while he told it. She had known. Of course she had known. She had moved the settee in front of the wall 5 years ago to spare him the sight of his own bad afternoon, and if she knew that, she knew all of it, and had known all day, and had said nothing, and had let the cleaning bring it out at its own pace, and had stood ready with her small kindnesses, the drawer for the ticket, the privacy over the letter, the settee moved, to make the bringing out gentle. It was, Watson thought, the most delicate piece of work done in that room all day, and she had done it with a broom in her hand and never once let on that she was doing it. She felt his look, and met it, for a moment, over the head of the man at the window, and she did not smile, quite, but something passed between them, an understanding, a shared keeping of a thing that did not need to be spoken between them any more than it needed to be spoken to Holmes, and then she bent again to her boards, and the moment was let go, as all the moments of that day were let go, gently into the work. "Well," said Holmes at last, turning from the window. The amber light was on him now, the low rich light of the evening, and it had softened the sharp lines of him, and he looked, Watson thought, tired in an unfamiliar way, not the tiredness of a case, the tiredness he wore like a coat, and shed the moment the next problem came, but a plainer, older tiredness, the tiredness of a man who has spent an afternoon in the company of his own past and found it, on the whole, bearable, but heavy to have carried again, even for an hour. "Well," he said again, "you have your history, Watson, and your row of things, and now you may sweep them up, all but—" he hesitated, "all but the two halves of the cufflink, which you may put together in the drawer, with the letter where they belong. The Bradshaw may go on the fire, the cigarettes to the ash-bin. The mark in the wall," he looked at it low on the pale plaster, "the mark in the wall may stay. Mrs. Hudson has hidden it long enough. It has earned the right to be seen, I think, now that I know what it was hiding." And Watson did as he was bid, laid the second cufflink in the drawer beside the first and the folded letter, so that the pair lay together at last, reunited after 5 years apart in the dark on the paper, and fed the old Bradshaw to the low fire where it took slowly, being thick and damp, and burned with a small steady flame that threw a last warmth into the darkening room, and swept the 41 cigarette ends into the ash bin, the record of a long hard telling gone at last to where such records go. And when he had done it, and turned back, he found that Holmes had settled, without announcing it, into the great armchair by the hearth, drawn back to the wall still where the moving had left it, and had leaned his head against its wing, and was watching the small flame of the burning Bradshaw with heavy eyes. "I shall supervise the finishing," Holmes said, "from here." "You shall do no such thing," said Mrs. Hudson, but gently now, without any edge at all, straightening from her boards to look at him. "I shall supervise," said Holmes, silently, and with my eyes closed, which is the highest form of the art, and you will scarcely know I am doing it, and the work will be the better for it. And his eyes were closing even as he said it, on the last of the amber light and the small flame in the grate and the clean bare room and the row of things now cleared away, and the even voice slowed and thinned, and the last of the sentence came out on the edge of sleep barely shaped. And then he said nothing more, and his head settled against the wing of the chair, and the long day, which had emptied and beaten and burned and understood the whole of that room, came at last for the man at the centre of it to rest. He was asleep. Watson stood and looked at him a moment, the sharp, restless mind gone still at last, the guarded face gone open in the firelight, the man who could not bear to be seen doing a kindness, fallen asleep in the middle of the plainest and hardest kindness of all, which was to say the thing aloud and then let it go. He had pretended to supervise, and he had fallen asleep pretending, exactly as a tired man does at the end of a long day, when the thing that has been weighing on him is finally set down, and there was nothing to do about it, and nothing that wanted doing, but to let him sleep. "Leave him," said Mrs. Hudson softly, though Watson had made no move to wake him. "He has had the room turned out from under him, and a hard afternoon of remembering into the bargain, and he has earned an hour in the chair if any man ever did. We shall finish quiet." She looked at the sleeping man, and there was in her face, unguarded now that he could not see it, a plain and unsentimental fondness, the fondness of a woman who has kept a difficult man's house for 11 years, and knows to the ounce what he is worth, and has never once told him. "There," she said, half to herself, drawing a fold of the loose antimacassar down over the arm of the chair, where the evening chill might reach him. "There. Sleep then. The room will keep till you wake, and the day is nearly done, and there is nothing left in it now that anyone need lose a wink of sleep over. Not any more, not now it is said." And the fire settled, and the last of the Bradshaw fell to ash, and the clock ticked on over the shining mantel, and through the open windows the blue of the evening came slowly into the room, and the street below had gone nearly silent, only a late cab now and then, far off, its wheels ticking away into the dusk, and the two of them, the doctor and the landlady, moved quietly about the last of the work, in the last of the light, around the sleeping man in the chair, finishing the room by touch and habit as the day went down, the whole long labour of it drawing toward its close gently and warm, with nothing left unsaid that needed saying, and the one thing that had needed saying said at last, and let go and covered over now not with dust but with sleep. The room, when it was done, was a room none of them quite recognised. It came together in the last of the light, piece by piece, as Watson and Mrs. Hudson worked the final hour of it, in near silence around the sleeping man in the chair. The rugs came up from the yard, aired and sunned and light as they had not been in a year, and went down again in their places, the great turkey red across the centre, and the worn Persian by the hearth, and the drab runner in the doorway, and the room took them back and was the warmer for it, exactly as Mrs. Hudson had promised, for there is no warmth like a rug that has held the sun, and the sitting room, receiving its 3 back at the day's end, seemed to settle onto them and sigh. The furniture came in off the walls to its proper stations, walked corner over corner in the dusk, and the settee went back, though not, Watson noticed, quite to where it had been. Mrs. Hudson set it a foot along the wall, clear of the mark in the plaster, so that the dent stood now in the open, low and small and greyed, no longer hidden by anything, a thing looked at plainly at last. And the mantle shone, and the marble held the last light, and on it the clock ticked over, a surface cleared of a decade of postponements, the letters gone, the jar filled fresh, the slipper brushed and back in its place with its toe full of tobacco, curled and comfortable as an old cat come home. They lit no lamp for a while. They let the blue evening come into the room and fill it, the clean bare-aired room, and they moved about the last small tasks by the light of the low fire and the last of the sky, and neither of them spoke above a murmur, for the man in the chair slept on, and there was no reason in the world to wake him. And in the stillness, the day's work done, the street below gone quiet, the window still open to the cool coming down of the evening, the clock came fully into its own. All day it had been under something, the street, the fire, the beater, the scrape and talk and labour. Now there was nothing over it at all. The room had been emptied of its noise as it had been emptied of its dust, and what was left in the blue quiet was the clock, tick, 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 small and even and patient on the shining mantle, the loudest thing in a room that had that morning been too full of sound to hear it. It ticked on over the sleeping man, and the reunited cufflinks in their drawer, and the mark in the wall newly brought to light, over the whole long day now folding to its close, keeping its even unhurried time as it had kept it through all of it, indifferent and faithful, the one thing in the house that had never needed cleaning, because it had never once stopped, or looked back, or minded what it carried. Holmes woke to the sound of it. He woke the way a genuinely tired man wakes from a chair at dusk, slowly, without alarm, coming up out of sleep by degrees into a room gone dim and blue and strange, and for a moment he did not move, only lay in the wing of the chair with his eyes open, listening to the clock, taking in the changed room by the last of the light. Watson, across the hearth, watched him find it, watched his eye travel the cleared mantle and the shining marble, and the rugs down warm in their places and the furniture in its proper stations, and come to rest, at last, on the small greyed dent in the plaster, uncovered now, plain to see. "You've made it unrecognisable," Holmes said. His voice was rough with sleep and quite without complaint. "Mrs. Hudson made it unrecognisable," said Watson. "I dusted." "You dusted," Holmes agreed gravely, "and I supervised, and between the three of us a winter has been carried out of this room and a good deal else besides." He looked about him again, slowly, at the whole clean-aired, warm expanse of it. "It is a very fine room," he said, in the tone of a man surprised into honesty. "I shall not be able to find anything in it for a fortnight, and I shall resent it bitterly, and I would not have it back the way it was for the world. There. You may write that down, Watson, and hold it against me, for I shall deny having said it by morning." Mrs. Hudson, gathering the last of her cloths, allowed herself the smallest of smiles. "A fortnight," she said, "is longer than I dared hope for. I have known this room undo a morning's work by luncheon. If it holds a fortnight, I shall count myself repaid." She looked at the two of them, the doctor by the hearth and the detective come up out of sleep in the chair, in the blue quiet of the finished room, and she seemed about to say something more and then did not, and only nodded once to the day and the work and the whole of it, and took up her basket. "I shall send the girl up with something at 8, she said. "You will both be the better for eating, and you, Mr. Holmes, will be the better for going to your bed at a Christian hour, though I have as much hope of that as I have of the room staying tidy, and for the same reason." And she went, and her tread went down the 17 stairs, even and unhurried, the last of the day's footsteps on the stair fading, and the two men were left in the room with the clock and the fire and the coming dark. They did not talk much after that. There did not seem to be a need. Holmes stayed in the chair, and Watson lit the lamp at last, one lamp low, and drew the windows down against the evening chill, and the street sound thinned and was shut softly out, and the room closed warm around its one small light, and he sat in the other chair with his journal on his knee, for it was his habit to set the day down before he slept, and this had been a day worth the setting. He did not write what he had understood. He found, pen in hand, that he did not want to, that the whole delicate matter of the journey and the man who smoked and the name kept out of the light was a thing to be left exactly where his friend had left it, in the drawer, in the dark, with the cufflinks and the letter, unwritten and unpublished, one of the many cases the world would never read because the whole of the doing of it had been to keep the world from reading it. To set it down, even in a private book, even in kindness, would be to undo by an inch the thing Holmes had spent 5 years and a bullet in the wall to do whole, so he left it out. He would always leave it out. What he wrote instead was small and plain and true. He wrote that the sitting room at Baker Street had been cleaned that day, the 14th of April, the first warm day of the year, that Mrs. Hudson had turned it out from top to bottom against all opposition and much witty resistance, that a great many things had come up from behind the settee and under the mantel that had been lost a long time, that Holmes had been sent to a window seat and had disobeyed the spirit of the instruction while keeping to its letter, and that the room was now, at the day's end, scrubbed and aired and shining and warm and unrecognisably tidy, and altogether a better place to sit than it had been that morning. And then, because he was an honest man and knew his friend and knew the room, he added the last line, the one that was the truest of all: it will not last. A fortnight, Holmes says, and he is, if anything, generous. The letters will begin to gather on the mantel again, and the tobacco to accumulate in improbable places, and the small lost things to drift toward the dark spaces under the furniture, until in a season or two the room has grown back its comfortable disorder, and the cleaning is only a memory and a smell of beeswax fading. And this, he underlined it once, lightly, is entirely as it should be. A room that stayed perfectly tidy would be a room no one truly lived in. The disorder is the life. We shall let it come back in its own time and be glad of it, and in another year, on another warm morning, Mrs. Hudson will turn it all out again, and find another year's worth of things behind the settee, and it will all be exactly as it should be, world without end. He read it over and was content with it, and closed the book. Across the hearth, Holmes had leaned his head again against the wing of the chair, and his eyes were closed once more, though whether in sleep or only in the ease of a long day ended Watson could not have said. The lamp burned low and warm. The fire settled toward its embers. The clock ticked on the shining mantel, small and even and patient, over the two of them, and the quiet room, and the drawer where the cufflinks lay together at last and the mark in the wall no longer hidden. And beyond the drawn windows the great city went on into its night. The wheels grown few, the lamps come out, the whole of London settling toward its rest as the room had settled toward its own. And the day that had emptied and beaten and burned and understood this small warm room drew at the last gently to its close with everything in its place, and the one thing that had needed saying said and let go, and nothing left in the whole of the evening that anyone need lose a wink of sleep over. Not any more, not now. Only the low fire and the low lamp, and the even faithful ticking of the clock carrying them all unhurried, out of the long day and down into the quiet and the dark and the good deep sleep at the end of it. Sleep now. The room is clean, and the day is done, and all is exactly as it should be.